So welcome, everybody. I am very happy to have Michael McMahon today, who will talk to us about monetary policymakers' uncertainty. This paper is joint work with Anna Cheslak and Stephen Hansen and Song Xiao. I hope I pronounced it okay. Um, so before I hand over to Michael, let me explain a little bit the ground rules. So the talk will take place in the first 45 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes dedicated to open discussion. But if you have questions during the talk, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we will find points during the talk where we'll ask Michael to address these questions. You can also, if you have a very pressing question, raise your hand, and then we can allow you to speak during the talk. Otherwise, after the talk, please raise your hand, and we'll have a further kind of Q&A during the last 50 minutes of the talk. So without further ado, Michael, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to at least virtually be here, so thanks very much for the invitation. And as you said, this is sort of preliminary work in progress work with Anna, Stephen, and Song. Song, I think, is in the audience, so if I get any tough questions, I may ask Francesca to find him and get him to try and help me out. I don't think it really applies given what I'm talking about today, but just in case, I have to give the usual disclaimer that this is not necessarily the views of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, which I sit on. So let me tell you, so I got to tell you a 30-second background to this paper. Well, actually, to this presentation. So when Francesca asked me to present something, there was some options I had to present which were sort of much more, to use the phrase that became popular here in the last few years, something a bit more oven ready. But Francesca was very insistent that she'd like to see something that was sort of looking at communication or text, or some of that work which I've been doing over the last number of years. And so there's this project, and this project, it's not the first time I've presented it, but this work is really evolving. And as I explained to some of my own students last week, all research projects, at least in my experience, go through cycles. And at some point last week, I felt this was at a trough, and I was very nervous about presenting it. I hope I have at least something to interest you, but I'm certainly not in sales mode. I'm not trying to convince you of this is the answer, this is the definitive reasoning on this topic. So what we're interested in here is uncertainty. Okay, and uncertainty has become incredibly popular. I mean, it goes back. I mean, I guess Dixit Pindick is a famous example, but then Nick Bloom's work, that's his 2009 Econometrica, about uncertainty shocks and the effect they can have on the macroeconomy. And there's some really nice work by Jesus Fernandez Villaverde and others. It's become a really popular thing to look at. And with that, there's also been a growing interest in policy uncertainty. So Baker, Bloom, and Davis, so Nick Bloom as well, but Steve Davis have this sort of QJE paper where they talk about measures of uncertainty about policy, and they show essentially that these act like demand shocks. There's another version which specifically targeted monetary policy uncertainty, and Husted, Rogers and Son from the Fed. And so just to sort of fix ideas, think about monetary policy uncertainty as existing measures have measured it, as the degree of uncertainty that the public perceives about Federal Reserve policy actions and their consequences. Now, of course, if you want to measure this in the UK, you could think about Bank of England policy actions, or ECB, or wherever you're particularly interested. as I said, the sort of key finding in this literature is that policy uncertainty shocks have sort of consequences in the real economy, and they look very much like demand shocks. Okay. Where we sort of come at this issue is asking, well, are these existing measures really policymakers' uncertainty? Okay, so if you think about it, you think, well, if the people, you know, out in the public and the existing measures are typically based off counts of uncertainty and monetary policy words in newspapers. So if the newspapers are sort of uncertain about what the central bank is going to do, does that necessarily mean the policymakers are uncertain? Okay, so a first sort of question we want to answer is, you know, how can we measure actual policymakers' uncertainty? So what I'm going to call PMU. I'll keep repeating this because I know the number of acronyms can get confusing. A second question, and I think what really got me interested in this topic is, you know, what generates whatever uncertainty policymakers have? And in particular, it was motivated by something which is on a later slide, but I'll say it here. You know, one reason why the world, you know, the public, the firms, markets would be uncertain about what the central bank will do is because we know the central bank reacts to the state of the economy. And the state of the economy is itself inherently uncertain. So if the world is more uncertain, we don't know what state of the world will exist in 6 months' time or a year's time. So we don't really know what the policymaker will have done in reaction to that. So there's a sort of question in terms of, you know, if we want to map between this sort of economic policy uncertainty and policymakers themselves uncertainty, there's a question of how much they're sort of both just reacting to uncertainty in the economy. And then there's a much bigger question. I think this is where I have probably the most interesting questions. I have some answers, but I don't really have the final word yet on it. But there's this open question that, you know, how should policymakers react to uncertainty? There's a number of models that exist, and I'll talk a little bit about them, but a lot of them touch on different aspects of policy uncertainty relative to what we seem to find in the data. And I sort of put this question, does the source of the shock matter? Partly as a reminiscing device for all the people listening who've worked at the Bank of England and heard that question probably once a day. So a sort of question then is, you know, how should policymakers behave, and do they behave in line with those models? Okay, so as I said, I'm not in sales mode. I don't have a sort of definitive narrative for this paper laid out. You know, I'm going to try and convince you that EPU or monetary policy uncertainty as currently exist are not equivalent to policymakers' uncertainty as we're going to measure it. And I think that's a starting interesting point. From that come a number of other points. So I'll touch on, you know, I think it's what we uncover, I think is interesting. It's time varying. It's very complex. Okay, so we're trying to dig into that. One thing that I think is going to come out, and I'll see how you react to this, is, but this is, others have thought this as well. What we're going to find as policymakers' uncertainty, maybe a second moment is not the right one. Maybe it's actually a skew issue, and you'll see that when I show how these measures of uncertainty actually reflect in how people talk about policy. And then I'm going to show you that there are at least 2 reactions to uncertainty by policymakers, both of which have been discussed in the data. But what's interesting is which shocks they respond to with which. So one is a kind of wait and see approach, and the other is a get at the head of the curve. So if I can sort of convince you of these broad things, even if I don't have the sort of full thing tied together, then that I'll feel I've done at least most of my job. But of course, you know, like I say, this is really work in progress. So comments, suggestions, etc., most welcomed. Okay, so let me sort of get started on just pointing out something for I mean, given the links, the central bank links in the group here at King's, this is probably, you know, totally known to everyone, but you know, it's worth making clear. Uncertainty is ubiquitous in monetary policy. So in other words, you can even have, you know, this is a graph from Bundick and Hereford. You know, it sort of shows using the Fed, the euro dollar options, actually what the Fed's interest rate is going to be in a year from now. And you can see that there is, you know, there's quite a bit of uncertainty, and it moves a bit. It even moves around when they've made a decision. So the weight on 0.5 went up after the decision on March 16th in 2016. But Greenspan has this lovely quote, which I use quite a lot. Uncertainty is not just an important feature of the monetary policy landscape, it is the defining characteristic of that landscape. So essentially, everything that policymakers discuss, they do so with a large air of uncertainty around it. Okay, and I'm going to touch on a few of the types of it, right? So one is, this is a quote from John Williams. He talks about, look, I'd love to be able to tell you what's going to happen to the economy, but I can't. But I can tell you how I will react to different states of the economy, and therefore you'll get some understanding of what I'll do, what we would call the reaction function. So, in a way, this is sort of suggesting that there's data or economic uncertainty, which, is captured here in the Bank of England's fan charts. This is for GDP growth. And so with GDP growth, there is uncertainty not just about the future, but also about the past. So we don't know where we've been, and we can only make guesses as to where we're going. There are others that the literature have looked at. These include things like parameter uncertainty, or even just model structure uncertainty. So Jim Bullard in the transcripts of the FOMC says, has this line: the uncertainty we face is profound, and it's at the model level, not at the rules level. So again, this idea that we are going to communicate our reaction function, but ultimately we're in a world where we don't know what the world really, how it operates perfectly. And so we're constantly having to react. And all of this is sort of just feels very different to the kind of randomness in their policy recommendations, which may exist because of norms of moving by 25 basis points. You might want to move by 20, but you typically move by 25. So there's a kind of 5 basis point extra move in there. But that aside, all this other stuff doesn't seem like just the sort of variation in monetary policy shocks that we would have in our DSGE models. And another source that you might worry about is that actually what generates the outsiders' views of what the Fed will do is you might have internals who have one view and another set of internal members who have a different view. And between them, the people in the committee, we don't know which one will win out. So the markets are inherently uncertain as to which will win out. But maybe neither of the policymakers are particularly uncertain. They just disagree. Okay. So that's one of the challenges. And the second one that I'm going to talk about quite a lot is this idea of the reaction function, right? So let me jump straight into thinking about what we measure currently as monetary policy uncertainty and how it does or does not relate to what the Fed itself is thinking. So like I said, if you think of a very simple reaction function, so on here, this is the equation where phi are some kind of coefficients, and omega t is a vector which contains all of the variables to which the central bank might react. So again, in a standard simple Taylor rule, you're going to think of maybe the output gap and inflation gap. But in theory, you could add a much larger vector, and exchange rates in some countries might be important, and so on. What's certainly clear is the sort of description I gave, which came from the Husted-Rogers Sun paper about uncertainty about the left-hand side of this. It's clearly mixing up, even in our basic models, the uncertainty that would come from the state of the economy and the uncertainty that would come from any sort of policy type shocks, be they on epsilon, or if you want to think about them as changing phi reaction coefficients. So they're sort of both mixed up there. And you can see that if you look at newspapers that would pass the test of containing uncertainty, but also containing monetary policy. So here's an article from the 21st of June last year, setting monetary policy at a time of profound uncertainty about the way economies are functioning is never an easy task, right? So, okay, that seems like it's certainly something about uncertainty and monetary policy, but it's really saying that the world is inherently uncertain. And even, what a happier time 2019 was, when we would have thought that, just some sort of political independence and the sort of tug of war that was going on, and still is, about independence was the kind of profound uncertainty. This year has caused us to reevaluate what we mean by profound uncertainty, I think. But setting monetary policy in that environment is tough. Fine. Here's another one, though. Here they talk about, the Fed, its assessment, but it has concerns about global weakness and trade uncertainties hitting business. And it's talking a little bit about the economic uncertainty. and the Fed's view, and thinking they could be wrong. So again, yeah, it's catching it, but it's also catching some of the economic uncertainty in this monetary policy uncertainty. Here we have an even clearer case. This is for the UK, where the uncertainty is clearly political. As you know, sterling fell to its weakest level as political uncertainty continued to drag. It also happened that a weak run of data has added to the concern, while the Bank of England holds an MPC meeting this week. So you can see there, you're mixing in lots of different types of uncertainty. Okay, so in order to measure policymakers themselves uncertainty, today I'm going to focus on measures using the Federal Open Market Committee's transcripts. So these are nearly verbatim policy meeting accounts, and they come with a lag of about 5 years. It's sometimes a little bit longer because they release them all in one go. So the January ones are released with the December ones, and they wait till the December ones have made the full 5 years. We have in this project, and we have sort of on my computer, I have the same things for statements, for minutes, looking in the teal books, so the green and the blue books, and even looking at speeches. So, but for today, I'm going to focus on the sort of period from Greenspan taking over in '87 up until 2013, which is about 3.5 million words. But there's about, after you clean a bunch of the stop words and very rare words, we have about 5,000 unique words in this, but obviously repeated many times across nearly 300,000 sentences. Okay. So in line with what's done for the external, so the Baker, Bloom and Davis type approach, what they do is they count newspaper articles that contain uncertainty and say monetary policy for that index. And they normalize that by the total number of articles. And they use that as their index. So we can do a very similar thing. What's sort of neat about what we can do is we can do it at sort of more and more disaggregate levels. Okay, so here's the most general version, and I'll do very little with this particular individual member section level, but we can count how often a member says uncertain words. Okay, so how do we define uncertain words? I'll speak about them on the next slide, but essentially we have a dictionary. In fact, we have many dictionaries that lay out to varying degrees of breadth words that we think encompass uncertainty. But you can measure at the sentence level by a particular member in a particular section of the FOMC meeting whether or not they've said uncertain words. So most basic uncertain word dictionary is just the word uncertainty. Now we tend not to use just that. We'll use uncertainty, uncertainties, uncertain, group them all together, and we'll count. And so you might have a sentence that has no mention of that word and another which has one or maybe even two. And what we do is we sort of count up all the mentions of that word, those uncertainty words, and then we normalize them by the total number of words spoken, and that gives you an index. Now you can obviously measure this stuff at whatever level of disaggregation you want. Most of what I'm going to show you is going to be either at the meeting section level, aggregating across people, and occasionally meeting section and disaggregating between the staff of the Federal Reserve and the members of the policymaking committee, the FOMC. Okay, but it's a very simple measure. Okay, so we're sort of very similar to the existing literature. So as I said, one very simple dictionary is just words that are uncertain, or the root is uncertain, and then whatever versions of that you want. You can similarly count risk, but one big problem we have with using risk is there are a number of occasions where policymakers use risk really to help describe their policy choice rather than the say second moment or third moment around that. So the big one is the use of the expression balance of risks, but also when they talk about financial markets, they often talk about things like risk premia. And so it's at some level there's a sort of choice that you can make. We've played around with different ways to make this choice, including using sort of fancy techniques like the Google models to say if this is uncertainty, what words in the corpus are very similar to that. So this idea of word to vec or word embeddings. But again, we also have a sort of wider uncertainty dictionary, which includes words like uncertainty and risks and can adjust for these things like balance of risk taken out or risk premia taken out, but also uses other words that you might use if you were in a meeting describing your views and being uncertain. You know, I worry about this. I interpret this with caution or whatever. And so we have these various ones, and I'll show you. You know, I can create many of these measures, and we have done. The last bit of the data that you need to know is the meeting itself. So the transcripts give you, like I said, nearly verbatim run through of the actual decision. But the one of the interesting things is that the structure of the meeting is relatively regular, at least the three main parts. There's a part where they discuss financial market conditions. There's a part where they discuss economic conditions, which Stephen and I in our earlier work started referring to it as FOMC 1, and that seems to have stuck with us. But we can think about that as the economic discussion. And then they discuss the appropriate policy stance, which we called FOMC 2, but you can also think of as monetary strategy section. And within those sections, there's typically a staff presentation, Q&A for the staff, and then the FOMC members go around the table and express their views. The meetings themselves contain a number of other sections. So there's a whole bunch of stuff on pleasantries, you know, welcome to the meeting, election of formal people to positions. They have days where they spend just discussing a special topic. But essentially one thing which we did for some of our earlier work is we have split the transcripts into these different sections so we can actually look at how they talk about different, in different parts of the meeting. And so for most of what I show you today, I will focus on limiting the transcripts to just these three main parts of the policy discussion. Okay, right, before I show pictures, are there any questions on data or approach?
I'm going to have a quick question. I'm going to start with a quick question, and then I'll see if others want to pitch in. But so my question regards the creation of this, uncertainty index, finding the exact words. So I've always wondered whether if I say, oh, I am less uncertain about the state of the economy at the moment, would that be picked up as a measure of uncertainty, or are you able to, for example, group words together so that, saying more uncertain or worried does indeed indicate uncertainty, while if I say I am not worried or I am less uncertain.
Yeah. So you're hitting on the classic question of negation. So you can easily adjust for that. So you can pull out. Now the difficulty comes if the negation is, really complex language structure. So if I said to you, what I'm about to say represents the opposite of my views, I am highly uncertain about this. Now we can't do that. But if you just want to strip out when uncertain is preceded by not or less or some other word, that you can do. And it's very simple. You just then, if I go back, where you're essentially defining this index function to be 1 if it's in the dictionary, you would just have a -1 or you replace it with a 0 wherever it's less. So that's fine. That's not a problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for now.
Okay.
I'll let you go on.
Fine. Let me show you some pictures then. Pictures are easy. So here's 3 different measures. So the blue is just counting the word uncertain, or it's sort of the root uncertain. And then you add, the risk words, which again, like I said, they occur quite a lot. And then the green is when you take the wider dictionary. Now, these things are all sort of correlated, not perfectly so. And they do certainly point to, this period just before the financial crisis was a period when uncertainty sort of reached high levels. There was also this big peak in 2003, which coincided with the Iraq war, which is, as far as I can tell, the only occasion that the Fed released a decision where they basically said publicly, we have no idea what's going to happen. The invasion has just taken place. We're just going to wait and see. But so at least it's picking up some nice things. We can also standardize these because, of course, the issue is that we count much fewer words when we look at just one word or a few words versus a broader dictionary. And again, you can see that these are fairly highly correlated, but not perfectly so. So that's sort of nice to start with. You can also sort of move from here to here, very subtle changes, but what it does is it moves just to looking at those three main sections that I described. And the reason we do this is because, like I said, there are occasionally times where there's, say, a special topic, and the special topic discusses a lot of uncertainty. So we want to make sure that we don't mix that in with policymakers being uncertain when it's actually the staff telling them how, you know, uncertainty might affect the economy. Compared to Baker, Bloom, and Davis, well, you can see there's some correlation. You know, they in 2003 both went up, but there are lots of times when Baker, Bloom, and Davis measure seems to go up very high, but policymakers themselves are not there, not at the same level, at least relatively speaking. And you know, there are other times when the gaps open up as well. And similarly with the Husted, Rogers and Son. And again, this sort of early 2000s period, the committee seemed quite certain, relatively speaking, but the rest of the world was much less so about what they would do. So I just saw a question come in from Martin. Martin, no, in what we're doing now, we're aggregating to the actually so far to the overall meeting level. So we're mixing together staff and members. Well, I'm gonna change that in a second. But you're right, you know, if you want, and as I suggested, you can sort of pull out the member level stuff, and then once you do the standardization, you're sort of pulling out its relative mean as well. That's the equivalent of a person fixed effect. But yeah, that's in what I've done so far, that's not important, but you'll see something in a moment. So here's first of all where we can split it. The blue line is what we were looking at before, again for the three main sections. And then you have times when the staff are represented by the green and they're more uncertain, or at least when they present, they have relatively higher measures of uncertainty. And the members themselves sometimes do not, but other times they have much more than the staff. So again, there's this question of where does the uncertainty come from? And there certainly seem like times when the staff are the ones who are sort of really uncertain, but the members don't seem to take it on as much. And vice versa, there are times when the staff haven't been particularly uncertain and the members are. You can also look at this across the different sections. So the three main sections, the markets, the economics, and the policy. And you know, you see the green line is particularly interesting because quite often this thing just has essentially its minimal value of 0 for long periods, because there was a long time, particularly before the financial crisis, when the members spoke very little in the discussion of the financial markets section. They would sort of hear the presentation and then move on to the economics. But you do see that since then the discussion of uncertainty seems to have gone up in markets around the financial crisis and even after that with the European debt crisis, etc. But, you know, and this is the members one. So the flat line for the members are where you see them just not talking. But then, like I said, there are occasions where they get very worried and talk quite a lot about the uncertainty in the markets. And similarly, there are times when it's economics driving it and times when it's the policy discussion that drives it. The staff, again, they're a little bit more constant in that they always talk a little bit about uncertainty, but Martin, this is where I'm not going to use this at all, but if you wanted to do this at the member level, this is just to show you these are the member level ones. There's too many members to list all the names, but you can see that in any given meeting there is quite a distribution of how uncertain they are relative to their own norms. So this wonderful gray line that's jumping across, in case anyone sort of is interesting, it always stands out quite a bit. This is Janet Yellen. So Janet Yellen served on the committee, then went to the Council of Economic Advisors and came back later back onto the committee as, first of all, I can't remember the order. She came back after the CEA after a while, and then obviously went on to become chair. But I should just delete that, but it always reminds me to talk about her.
Michael, let me jump in to ask you a quick question from Laurent Ferrara, who is asking, If there are only 8 FOMC meetings per year, how do you get the monthly series?
So these are not perfectly monthly series. These are meeting level series. So I mean, you can get a monthly series if you want, but what you have to do is you just have to assume that in the month where there's no meeting, it's what it was at the last meeting. That's not an issue when we do what I won't talk about later, but which you can talk about is when you start measuring some of the external communication, like speeches, because they of course occur at more frequent intervals, but they have other issues, which is that the exact topic of them varies quite a lot, and also they have these blackout periods where they don't speak around the decision. So, but everything I'm showing you here is just meeting level. So when I show you a comparison of, say, this measure with the Baker, Bloom, and Davis or the Husted, Rogers, Sun, we're just comparing the measures for the same month. So for the month of, say, January 2000, if there's a meeting then, we'll look at the January 2000 measure for Baker, Bloom, and Davis.
Right, thank you.
Okay, but so let me, so in a sense, you know, one of the difficulties is how do you extract language about the different things? And we've done many different ways of this: unsupervised methods, supervised methods. They're all in the appendix if anyone wants to see them, or I have them elsewhere on my computer. But for now, I'm just going to focus on particular measures that we look at for, you know, inflation, wages, and costs, and economic growth. And this is very simple. So we went back from complicated measures to more simple methods. And in particular, we essentially, what we do is we count again, but now if we identify, this is step 2, we identify an uncertainty word, then we take a window around that. So if it's in a particular sentence, then we're going to take the sentence before and the sentence after, and that's our little range of the sentences. And within that, we will then check if there are words that appear in another dictionary, which is a dictionary related to inflation, wages, or costs, or one related to the real economy. Now here, you could have double counting. So that's worth bearing in mind. If you find an inflation word, let's say, in that window, then you give a +1 to the inflation wages uncertainty. If you found, let's say in the sentence right afterwards, there was something about the real economy, we're also going to add to the economy, the growth index. Now, if in that window we don't find any words related to those two, we're going to just call it other. At some point in the future, I think we will probably add financial markets as something to absorb some of the other. But actually, you pick up most of the uncertainty as falling with words in their three sentence window. They have words that go in either one of these two or both. And then you have an index, an EG index and an IW index, and you again normalize it by the total words in that section, or in that section by the speaker, or in the meeting, whatever the right denominator is. And so you can see this. And again, the blue line is what we've had before using the uncertainty dictionary. And this is for all speakers. And you can see that there are periods where it's the inflation and wages that seem to be driving the uncertainty. And then there are other periods where inflation and wages are relatively low, but most of it is driven by economic growth concerns. And so that's sort of a first. You can do this again by the members, and you get even a little bit more variation or more gaps opening for the members, which I guess isn't surprising when you think the staff kind of always have to present on both, whereas the members can talk about just what's most pertinent to them. And so we have certainly these sort of gaps that open between them. But just to round off the sort of first question I asked, is this external measure that people have been using the same as what measures that you would get from internal? Here's a series of regressions. The first 3 columns are the Baker, Bloom, and Davis measures, and the last 3 are the Husted, Rogers, Sun measures. You can include VIX or not. It doesn't matter at all for Husted, Rogers, Sun. It does for Baker, Bloom, and Davis. But you can see there's certainly a correlation. There's a positive correlation between these things, which you would hope is at least there because they pertain to measure at least something that's related. But if you look at how much of the external uncertainty you can explain with measures from the internal, and again, you can add more and more, and sort of at best, you can capture about 1/3 of the variation. So so I think, you know, there's two ways you can look at this. One, there is some uncertainty that the public has that really isn't influencing policymakers. And you want to ask, you know, what is that? Where is it coming from? And is that having effects? And that's something we're looking at now. You know, one thing you might think of is their communication unclear? And a topic right up my heart, up my street. The other question you could argue is, of course, that maybe these different measures are picking up just different things. I mean, what I found most scary is that this Husted-Rogers Sun, which is specifically designed to pick up uncertainty about monetary policy, the transcript-based measures capture at most sort of 15% of that. So I think it's an important thing to recognize that EPU is not equivalent to policymakers' uncertainty, which is important, right? Because, you know, this idea that policymakers' uncertainty measured by EPU has these demand shock-like effects. Well, actually, it's not obvious that policymakers' behavior is necessarily driving all of that. So it's not like they are the cause of the shocks, but something, you know, people are attributing to them these shocks. Okay, let me just talk now a little bit about the second part, about, you know, how is policy uncertainty reflected in their decision making, and how should it be? So I won't go into much of this, but there's a lovely paper by Soderstrom about which is basically like taking the argument, for those aware of the literature, the idea from Brainard. So the idea in Brainard was, if you are uncertain about, say, the transmission of your policy to the real economy, so that would be, I don't know what the beta parameter is. He sort of solved for this and showed that actually that some form of gradualism is the optimal thing to do. You want to react less aggressively when you're uncertain about that. What's nice about the Soderstrom analysis, and I will skip through the details, but very standard sort of optimal monetary policy in a world of uncertainty model, except now you have alpha, beta, delta, and gamma all uncertain. Okay, so there's also these linear shocks, but the real important stuff comes from these parameter uncertainty terms. I'll skip this in the interest of time. It's just how you solve it. But here's essentially the plot you get. You get the sort of effects that that you would have thought if you were Brainard in the right hand side. So if just the term here on the lag effect of the output gap on inflation, if just that is what you're uncertain about, then actually you want to react your optimal coefficient, which again depends on the lambda, the weight you put on output versus inflation in your loss function. But for any given lambda, you want to put less of a reaction on output and less of a reaction on the inflation term. So your linear rule, you have these sort of phi terms dropping. However, if you're uncertain about this sort of AR1 coefficient, the persistence term in the inflation generation, actually you want to react more strongly. This is a kind of get ahead of the curve argument. The reason I love this paper is it sort of shows you that what you're uncertain about will determine how you should react. So let me sort of then look at this, whether we can see any of this in the data. And so for this, we're going to use an approach, which is the multinomial inverse regression. So this goes back to the sort of work of Taddy, but also Gentzkow and co-authors have used it. Stephen has used it in other work with Steve Davis. The basic idea, so let me sort of cut through this, is the basic idea is to see whether these uncertainty terms drive the likelihood that you use a particular word or phrase. Okay, so the Q here is like a probability of using a particular term in a meeting or in a meeting section, and you model that as a function of some covariates. And we're going to include in all of our regressions our economic growth and our inflation and wage uncertainty measures separately. These are correlated, but they're not that, they're 0.48, I think, is the correlation between them. I think if you're up at correlations like 0.8 or 0.7, you might worry a bit more, but so they're both included. We also have a dummy for the zero lower bound period because we go to 2013. We include some Green Book forecasts. Actually, this is there's a typo here. That's T+1, this is T+4. So it's the 4 quarter ahead GDP growth forecast. And then we have a dummy for when the committee is discussing in the old days, in the 90s, they had to, old days, 90s, they had to have a discussion twice a year on the long run targets for M3 growth, which took up a big chunk of the meeting, and actually did affect their language quite a lot. So for some of them we include that, but for most, when we just focus on the main sections, then it doesn't really matter. And we also include a time trend, because you might worry that some words that we use nowadays in talking about monetary policy, like forward guidance, maybe we didn't use this at all previously. So let's see. What you have to do for this is you have to pick the words that you're going to include. Now you can pick a lot of them, because essentially these multinomial inverse regressions, they're estimated in a way that's similar to lasso. So essentially there's a penalization term where if the explanatory variables are not adding enough power, they're just going to be penalized and put to zero. So in other words, if whether or not you're uncertain about inflation and wages or not, whether that index value makes no difference to the probability you use a given word or phrase, that's just going to be restricted to zero and move on to the next term or the next covariate. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to see whether this affects policy language. Now, there are lots of words, including multi-word tokens, that we have to worry about in the corpus. And so we're going to try and isolate policy language in one particular, well, in two ways overall. This is a sort of complicated way. Chatting yesterday to Stephen, I guess you could have just, looked at the words and made a choice, but here's what we've done. We have essentially measured an unconditional frequency of a given term, so the unconditional probability it appears in the document, and then we've sort of worked out, given that unconditional frequency, how often would you expect it to appear in the policy section of the meeting, where we've defined this using a set of sort of policy words. So sentences around the use of those policy words in this policy discussion part. Because the problem with policy discussion part is they also discuss a lot of economics, because the nature of monetary policy is that it is conditional on the state of the economy. And so we have this sort of this corpus that strips out the sort of policy sections from FOMC2. And we can work out, well, given how many words are in that, how often with the unconditional probability of seeing a given word or phrase would you expect to see it here? How often does it actually occur? And do a sort of chi-squared test to see whether we get a sort of abnormally higher occurrence. And essentially what we do is we end up pulling out words above a threshold. We end up with about 650 words that essentially are most likely to occur or abnormally likely to occur in the policy section. And we call that the policy dictionary. So 650 tokens. I'm not going to show you all the individual coefficients, but what you can see is, and what I found really striking, the words that, the likelihood of saying certain words is positively affected by being more uncertain about the economy. So here's one example. This is a word cloud just representing the sort of the size of the coefficients. But if you are more uncertain about the economy, you are more likely to say the economy is weak. So that's a two-word token. You're also more likely to talk about easing of policy, or cut, or talk about further easing, and the word prudent is in here. If you are more uncertain about the state of economic growth, you are less likely to say point increase. So the two-word token of point increase. You're also less likely to say pause. You're less likely to say formula. I have no idea what that means. So this is the sort of nature of this. This is picking up so essentially all the correlates in language with uncertainty from the first part of the meeting. Similarly, if you're uncertain about the inflation, you're more likely to say point increase. You're also more likely to say policy tighten. You're more likely to say inflation risk, misalignment, hawkish. These are words that are more likely by policymakers when they have expressed uncertainty about inflation and wages in the first part of the meeting. They're less likely to say these words like economic weakness, balance of risk, etc. Okay, so I don't expect to look through all of these. But one way you can see whether or not these types of uncertainty are affecting language in a differential way is to compare those vectors. So we have these 650 long vectors of words, and I know, Francesca, I'm eating into my discussion time now, but just give me a few more minutes. We can compare them, and we use cosine similarity. It has the nice benefit of, you know, if the vectors look of different total lengths, you can still compare how similar they are by the angle between them rather than the distance between them. So we do that, and you see that there's a negative cosine similarity. So it's essentially, these are not picking up the same things. What's interesting is, you know, I pulled out some particular expressions which with their coefficients, and don't look too much at the coefficients. We have to do some work to normalize these in a way that makes them interpretable, but which Stephen has done in some earlier work, and we just haven't done yet here. You know, makes sense, right? If they're more uncertain about the economy, they're more likely to talk about economic weakness. But already this should get you thinking, wait, you know, second moment says sort of mean preserving spread, right? I should be equally worried about an economic boom, but we're not. When they're worried about the economy, they tend to be worried about the negative tail, the downside. So that's why I sort of mentioned that this is sort of really looking like a skew thing. Equally, they're much less likely to say point increase, suggesting that rates should be lowered or loosened. And they're much more likely when they're uncertain about the state of the economy. Equally, they're more likely to say tighten or hawkish, and less likely when it's the other, when it's economic growth. And you can kind of go, what's really striking is it's the inflation and wage that's more likely to get this wait or pause. Although you do get a little bit of that also with economic growth on the wait and hold. But you're much less likely to say time to pause. When you are uncertain about inflation, you're much more likely to talk about the next move and to worry about mistakes. So this is, again, sort of thinking, you know, you're getting, even within inflation and wages, you're getting both the reaction of wait and see potentially, or pausing, but also about, you know, worrying about getting ahead of the curve, making mistakes. Okay. The other way we can get a set of policy words is by using a human audit. So this summer, we've done a huge exercise of reading each of these and labeling a bunch of things. And again, this is a much smaller set of words. This is 78 words or phrases, okay? Let me just skip these and jump to this. Again, negative cosine similarity between the vectors. So you are picking up different things with them. Interestingly, both are more likely to say the word prudent. Okay, so that's good. When they're uncertain about stuff, they think about prudence. When it's inflation and wages, they think more about inflation targets. They think less about easing, where more about easing when it's economic growth. Again, you get this pause, but now there's a slightly separate regression, and you get less likely to say pause when talking about economic growth. You know, less likely to talk about moving slowly, more aggressive action when it's the economic growth. Less likely to say gradual. So that's one thing. So now let me do one last thing to convince you, and then I'll wrap up. Okay, now imagine we were thinking about a Taylor rule. Okay, so here's a simple Taylor rule. The Fed funds rate depends on the Green Book forecast 4 quarters out for inflation and output. And you can see that you get a kind of standard reasonable fit from this. Now imagine we also interact each of those forecasts with these different measures of uncertainty. And what you find, this sort of talks a little bit to the Soderstrom model, you find that it's particularly the inflation uncertainty that makes them more likely to have a high coefficient, a high reaction to any output gap. Okay, so you get this sort of positive coefficient of 0.24. That's the only one that's statistically significant. Okay. Let me stop there. The plan was to try and convince you of these 4 things. I don't know if I've done on any, but you will soon tell me. There's a ton of stuff we still want to do on this, and in particular, disaggregating our measures of uncertainty a bit more, as much as we can, getting at the different sources of uncertainty that we see in the data, and equally to think about what is the right model of uncertainty for policymakers, and thinking about at least these 2 reactions, these things that make them wait and see, which I can think of as a sort of learning framework, and also those things which make them want to act quickly for example, when you see a big shock where the uncertainty is affecting the economy, you want to just get in and act and not worry about it, because it's sort of really harmful if you don't act quickly. And then just the final step of this project will be to think about the role of communication of uncertainty, which is, like I say, a topic very close to my heart. But let me stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Michael. This is very interesting work. So while I see that Martin has a question, Martin Wheel, so I'm going to allow Martin to talk. Martin, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. I mean, this is more an observation, but my sense was that wait and see was never very popular, and on the grounds that if you waited to see, then the signal actually wasn't clear, because something else would happen over the next 6 weeks or 3 months, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish what you were waiting for from what had accrued since. I don't know whether that's consistent with what you were finding. The only time I remember strong arguments for wait and see were after the Brexit vote, and there was a question whether one should wait to see what effect that actually had on the economy, or whether one should anticipate it. But otherwise, I mean, Charles Goodhart, for example, wrote firmly, waiting for things to become clearer, they never do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So funnily enough, we see quite a bit more wait and see behavior in the Fed. Now, whether it ends up in the policy action is different to whether we see it in the transcript. So when I say we see more of it, we see more people saying, words to the effect of we should wait for some more information on this. But this is precisely, I think there are occasions where you, as you mentioned for Brexit for the UK, there may be occasions where you do want to wait and see, but equally there are other occasions where you have to get ahead. But I guess the key thing I want to convince you of, first of all, is that neither of those are necessarily picked up by thinking about the second moment of a shock to the monetary policy rule in a DSGE model. I think learning, Francesca might put it in an ambiguity framework. I have another paper with a graduate student where we have a sort of robust control type environment where you allow sort of unspecified misspecification of your models, and that gets particular reactions. But I haven't of course sat in on the Bank of England's meetings, and we don't have the transcripts for those, but at least the idea of wait and see type responses is muted more often, I think, in the FOMC data than you're suggesting in the MPC.
Well, maybe if you were able to look at the MPC in the same way, you'd find my impression was wrong. That's perfect.
But like I said, I just want to be clear. You could always have someone saying we should really wait and see, and being overruled as well. So to say we see it being muted and it turning up in the policy are not equivalent either.
Yes, thank you.
So there's another question by Juan Carlos, who is asking you, how will you control your results by the difference between the institutional side and the personal side of the MPU? Or do you think it has no impact?
I mean, that's an empirical question. There are certainly differences. We do. I've done this when looking at the transcript. We've done this for many years. We already depersonalize, and apologies if anybody who's worked for the Fed or who currently works for the Fed is listening, but we depersonalize the staff in that we call them all the same person. Now, so I think in your language, that would be the institutional side, and that's certainly how we think of it. There are occasions where you might worry that, for example, the members of the members of staff have seen uncertainty and they've built that into their Green Book forecast. So you might think that some of the normal controls in a reaction function are picking up the effects of of uncertainty that's already been picked up by the staff, and then you might think it's the residual of the difference between the staff and the members that might help explain deviations from that. So you might imagine an interesting regression to run would be to say whether, you know, Romer type shocks can be picked up by this deviation between the staff and the members themselves. Well, I thought that was particularly an interesting hypothesis. It turns out it makes no difference. So I'm not sure I can answer your question by saying it has no impact at all. I'm certainly interested in potential impacts it has, but so far, I mean, there's some interesting variation, but I haven't found any particular thing where that variation makes a huge difference. The correlation between the two series is very high. So when you start to do it at a more disaggregate level, you start to get bigger differences, because we might both be equally uncertain, but I'm uncertain about the inflation outlook and you're uncertain about the growth outlook, and so we do get some differences. But so far, at least, but I'm not. I don't want to dismiss it. But so far, I haven't found a place where that really jumps out and screams, you know, big effect. But like I said, I thought if it was going to show up anywhere, it would be in explaining Romer shocks, and it did not. So
there's another question.
I can read them, Francesca. I can save you the hassle if you know.
Perfect. If you have them open and you want to answer, and then I'll keep my question for last.
Okay, so
this you read
this is Raghav's question about the compounding effects of uncertainty words close to each other, i.e. the distance between two uncertainty words. I can imagine the impact of they impact the severity of uncertainty. Does the model account for it? So the answer is no, the model doesn't account for it. I'm not entirely sure which way the results would go. Let me tell you where I think we're doing a better job than the existing sort of Baker, Bloom, and Davis approach. They measure that a newspaper article has at least one occurrence of the uncertainty word, and then it goes in the index. So in their world, there's no difference between an article that says uncertainty once and an article that says uncertainty 27 times. In our world, we can distinguish between the number of times you say it. Now, if I say it 5 times, but in one paragraph, is that more uncertainty, or is it more uncertainty if I say it 5 times across 20 paragraphs in different paragraphs? I actually tend to lean towards the latter. I get the sense from your question you're leaning towards the former. But as it stands, we would count, regardless of where they turn up within a given level of aggregation, they count to the index in the same way. So I don't know which way it would go, but at the moment, we only account for it if I talk about it and Francesca doesn't. If we're looking at individual level, then I would have uncertainty, she would not. But as soon as we aggregate, say Francesca and I are both members of the committee, as soon as we aggregate to the committee members level, whether I said it twice or I said it once and she said it once, doesn't matter. They will both add in.
There's another question from Laurent. I can read it for you if you wish, but I see that now you're reading it, so.
I am reading it. Yeah, you can tell I'm reading it because I'm looking at a second screen. My head goes elsewhere. Actually, I can stop doing that. I can just bring it to this screen. Okay, what's my view about forward guidance? Is it a way to reduce uncertainty? That's a great question. That's sort of what my last slide was about. In many ways, when we started this project, it was really my interest was most piqued about. I'm going to go even higher level than your question specifically about forward guidance. There is no knowledge, as far as I'm aware, that has both empirically and theoretically thought about what the optimal communication strategy for uncertainty is. Right? We have growing papers on the theories of optimal communication. You know, I think that there's a great paper by Mirko Wiederholt, which I saw years ago, and then again more recently, where you have this world where if the world is uncertain, you might want to communicate greater uncertainty because that might help you recover. Essentially, if by communicating uncertainty, people take actions that look and help the economy get back to a sort of a more normal state of behavior. Maybe it's optimal to communicate greater uncertainty than you truly have. Equally, you know, there could be huge damage to your credibility if you start, you know, telling the world, no, everything's fine. And then, you know, a year later, 2 years later, everything's really not fine. And that was totally predictable. So the answer to your question is, I don't know yet. I guess I have my own personal view. I don't have any research view that has been established from this, but that was certainly the direction that we wanted to go with when thinking about communication. What's really interesting, and I don't have the slides up anymore, but you could, if you measure the uncertainty of the members of the FOMC according to their discussions in the policy parts of the meeting, and you do the same thing for the minutes of the meeting. In the run-up to the financial crisis from 2005 onward, staff and actually no, members become increasingly uncertain in how they talk about the policy and the outlook. None of that got communicated. So this always gets me to ask this sort of what I think is the interesting question. Does this mean that they knew something bad was happening but did nothing about it, so I should feel angry towards them? Or should I be happy that at least they seem to be watching enough that they could see something developing but didn't have enough certainty to take action? I don't know what the right answer is, but I certainly think this distinction between what they talk about internally and what they communicate, and forward guidance is one manifestation of that, but there are others. I think it's a super interesting topic, and that's sort of where this project is on the road to. But you know, we're still sort of figuring out the sort of first stage of it. But that's a good question. Let me answer the next one very quickly. Yeah, okay, so the question is about how we get the positive and negative coefficient, the word clouds. This is an empirical result. Essentially what it says is, imagine you stack all the words. So let's say there's 100 words that you want to analyze. You stack them, and what you're doing is you're seeing across time whether variation in the use of those words is correlated with uncertainty, for instance, or economic growth uncertainty or inflation wage uncertainty. In that world, as uncertainty goes up, a positive coefficient means you're more likely to use the word. And if when you're more uncertain you use the word less, you're less likely to use the word. Now we have other controls in there like the Green Book forecast, the ZLB, types of meeting, a time trend. But so a negative coefficient is just a statistical outcome to say that when the committee is, this is done at the meeting level for now, but again, going back to Martin's very first question, you could do all of this at the person level, although there it becomes difficult because each person doesn't use so many words, so there's a lot more noise introduced. But what it means is that the committee, on average, the discussion, when they seem to have a high index value for economic growth uncertainty, there are some words that are more likely to appear in the later policy section and some words that are less. And the way I've been interpreting those is that that's telling us some effect of uncertainty on the discussions that the policymakers have. And what's interesting is the different types of uncertainty seem to affect the policies in different ways. I think that's the best answer I can give now. Other than that, I will. You just wait for the paper, and there'll be a full section explaining exactly how it's done. But if you're interested, Taddy 2013 explains these regressions.
We are out of time. I have a very quick question I wanted to ask you about, which relates to something that Laurent was saying, or actually the answer to your last, to Laurent's question, which is about the uncertainty and how it is used by policymakers. So the Bank of England, if you look at the fan charts, especially in the last period, they do seem to have increased a lot, and somehow this uncertainty never falls. So on the one hand, there is some degree of time dependence there and persistence. Indeed, I think that it's more difficult to communicate a decrease in uncertainty than an increase in uncertainty on the part of the policymakers. So I think that this does relate to how you use this and measure this.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this is so I call this the Ken Wallace critique. I'm sure others have made it, but my old colleague in Warwick, Ken Wallace, who's done a lot of work looking at the fan charts over their entire life, he was always and you know, it came up in the work I did with Matt Tong and Stephen looking at the inflation reports. You know, you had the kind of fan charts, just they wiggled around the sort of width of them, and then the financial crisis, they went bang, and they've never come back, right? And so this was Ken's complaint, that, you know, at that point it ceases to become a useful communication device, even if you're, you know, your epsilon up and down around that. It's not useful. I think that goes a little bit in the direction of what I was saying. You know, as central banks in the last 20 years in particular have communicated more and more about more and more things, you know, communication departments have grown. Interest in research on communication has grown. But do we have genuine sort of optimal theories of communication? I don't think we do. I don't think we do, particularly, as I said, about uncertainty. So let me say one other thing, just because you mentioned the fan charts. In separate work on communicating with the general public, the fan charts are about the best way you can communicate uncertainty with normal people. So that's not to say they understand it fully, but relative to words. So in the work I did with Andy, people kept complaining that if you talk simply, you know, you won't communicate uncertainty. So I actually experimented on that. And if you communicate in a complex way versus in a simple way, so think monetary policy summary versus the sort of layered content at the Bank of England, neither of those communicates uncertainty particularly well to normal people. It probably does to financial markets, but to normal people, you know, they don't get the distinction. The fan chart plays some role, at least, in doing that. So there's still I think there's an important role for them. The question I think that you were getting at, and I think it's the right question, is at what frequency do you adjust them, and to what extent should they truly reflect your policy deliberations, as opposed to what I would call, and this is being recorded, but I'll say it anyway, the cover your own ass approach, right? You know, so long as we make them wide enough, when something bad happens, we can say, well, that was in our bands. Well, of course it is. If your bands run from minus infinity to plus infinity, it's possible that it's going to happen, but it's not useful.
Thank you very much. I don't want to take up more of your time because we are definitely out of time. But thanks a lot for a really interesting talk, and thank you to all of those who participated and attended to the seminar. I just want to remind you that our next seminar will be on the 16th of November, and we'll have Michael Kiley from the Federal Reserve Board, who will be presenting his paper, Financial Conditions and Economic Activity, Insights from Machine Learning. Thank you, everybody. Bye, Michael. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the questions, and thanks, Francesca, David, and everyone at King's for having me. Very useful.